Summer 1943, an airfield near the Kuban River, Soviet Union. Soviet fighter pilot Ivan Babak watched as ground crews rolled out a gleaming new aircraft, its elliptical wings catching the morning sun. The Supermarine Spitfire, Mark 5B, fresh from Britain via the Persian corridor, represented one of history's most celebrated fighter aircraft. Within weeks, Babak would write in his diary words that captured a profound paradox. This famous plane that saved Britain cannot save us. It arrives too late, too worn, too different from what we need. The Spitfire, praised across the free world as a technological masterpiece, had encountered perhaps its only critics, Soviet pilots who needed different virtues from their fighters. What followed would reveal that even legendary weapons could fail when divorced from the conditions that made them legendary. The story of Soviet dissatisfaction with the Spitfire challenges every assumption about wartime equipment evaluation, demonstrating that excellence in one theatre could mean inadequacy in another. This wasn't about Soviet bias or propaganda. This was about cold mathematics, brutal honesty, and the recognition that fighting the Luftwaffe over the Eastern Front required different tools than fighting over southern England. The paradox began in October 1942, when Stalin personally requested Spitfires from Churchill. The Soviet leader had seen intelligence reports praising British success with the type. Churchill, eager to demonstrate Allied solidarity, agreed immediately. By early 1943, the first shipment of 143 Spitfire Mark 5Bs arrived through Persia. Soviet pilots, expecting miracles, discovered instead a complex reality that would strain their relationship with this famous aircraft. The fundamental problem wasn't the Spitfire's design. The aircraft that arrived in Soviet markings weren't fresh from the factory. These were battle-weary veterans, aircraft that had served with the Royal Air Force since 1941, accumulating hundreds of combat hours over hostile territory. Many had been rebuilt multiple times after combat damage. Wings had been replaced, fuselages had been repaired, engines had been overhauled repeatedly. Soviet technical inspectors discovered aircraft with patched bullet holes, replaced panels, and structural repairs that exceeded anything they considered acceptable for frontline service. The maintenance logs, when they existed, told stories of continuous service under brutal conditions. One aircraft had suffered 3 separate combat damages requiring major repairs. Another had been rebuilt twice after landing accidents. These weren't the pristine examples Soviet pilots expected. These were Britain's hand-me-downs, aircraft too worn for continued RAF frontline service, but deemed adequate for Lend-Lease transfer. The second shock came from recognising obsolescence. The Spitfire Mark 5B had been cutting-edge in 1941. By 1943, German fighter technology had evolved dramatically. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A had appeared in late 1941, shocking the RAF with performance that exceeded early Spitfire marks. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, introduced in 1942, featured improved engines and armament. Against these evolved threats, the Mark 5B struggled. Soviet test pilots at the State Research Institute conducted exhaustive trials. Their reports, declassified decades later, documented systematic performance deficiencies. Maximum speed at altitude fell short of contemporary German fighters. Rate of climb disappointed evaluators familiar with Soviet aircraft development. Most critically, performance below 15,000 feet, where Eastern Front combat typically occurred, failed to impress pilots accustomed to aircraft optimized for low-altitude operations. The test report concluded that the Spitfire Mark 5B offered no significant advantages over contemporary Soviet fighters while introducing numerous operational complications. Soviet pilots knew perfectly well that newer Spitfire variants existed. Intelligence reports described the Mark 9, introduced in mid-1942, featuring a more powerful 2-stage Merlin engine that restored performance parity with German fighters. Soviet aviation personnel had seen photographs of Mark 9s serving with RAF squadrons. The knowledge that Britain retained superior variants while sending obsolete versions created resentment that poisoned attitudes toward the aircraft. "Why send us your cast-offs?" one Soviet commander wrote, "when you keep the good ones for yourselves?" The third problem involved equipment removal and substitution. British officials, concerned about technology transfer, stripped certain items before shipment. Advanced radio equipment was removed and replaced with inferior sets. Gun sights were downgraded, navigation instruments were substituted. Most damagingly, maintenance manuals and spare parts catalogues were either not provided or supplied in insufficient quantities. Soviet ground crews found themselves maintaining complex foreign aircraft without proper documentation. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, magnificent in British hands with proper maintenance, became problematic when Soviet mechanics lacked detailed technical information. Cooling system issues plagued operations. Spark plug fouling occurred frequently. Supercharger problems reduced performance. Without proper manuals, Soviet mechanics improvised solutions that sometimes caused more problems than they solved. The ammunition situation particularly frustrated Soviet pilots. The Spitfire Mark 5B carried two 20mm Hispano cannons and 4.303-inch Browning machine guns. British doctrine emphasized this mixed armament. Soviet doctrine preferred heavier calibers. The .303-inch rounds seemed inadequate to pilots accustomed to heavier weapons. Worse, ammunition supply proved irregular. British .303 cartridges arrived sporadically. Soviet attempts to manufacture compatible ammunition failed due to subtle specification differences. Pilots found themselves rationing cannon ammunition while the machine guns sat partially loaded. The fourth source of dissatisfaction involved recognizing Soviet domestic recovery. When Lend-Lease began in 1941, Soviet aviation industry was reeling from German invasion. Factories had been evacuated eastward under desperate conditions. Production had collapsed. In that context, any foreign fighter seemed valuable. By 1943, the situation had transformed. Soviet factories had recovered. New designs had matured. The Yakovlev YAK-9, introduced in 1942, offered excellent performance with familiar handling and maintenance. The Lavochkin LA-5FN, featuring a powerful radial engine, provided ruggedness and firepower perfectly suited for Eastern Front conditions. Both aircraft were produced in vast quantities. Production figures for 1943 show over 16,000 YAK-9s built during the war, with over 14,000 completed before war's end. The LA-5 family saw nearly 10,000 aircraft completed. Soviet pilots increasingly wondered why they should struggle with unfamiliar British aircraft when excellent domestic alternatives existed in abundance. National pride factored significantly. Soviet aviation designers had overcome enormous obstacles to produce competitive fighters. Telling combat pilots to fly British cast-offs while superior Soviet aircraft existed felt like questioning their own industry's achievements. Many pilots quietly requested transfers to units equipped with Soviet types rather than continue flying Spitfires. Yet fairness requires acknowledging what Soviet pilots appreciated. Technical reports, even while criticizing overall suitability, praised specific characteristics. The all-metal construction impressed pilots familiar with wooden Soviet fighters. German cannon shells that would tear apart wooden structures often passed through aluminum skin with less catastrophic damage. Several pilots credited the Spitfire's sturdy construction with saving their lives after German attacks that would have destroyed wooden aircraft. The flight characteristics earned universal praise. Soviet test pilots, among the world's most skilled, universally admired the Spitfire's handling. Controls were light and responsive. The aircraft demonstrated excellent maneuverability in turning combat. Stall characteristics were gentle and forgiving. Roll rate, while not exceptional, was adequate. Multiple reports described the Spitfire as delightful to fly, a significant compliment from pilots who typically prioritized combat effectiveness over flying pleasure. One pilot wrote that flying the Spitfire was like dancing with a beautiful partner who unfortunately wasn't dressed for the weather. The visibility from the cockpit, particularly compared to early Soviet designs, impressed pilots accustomed to more obstructed views. The bubble canopy provided excellent awareness. Soviet pilots, trained to rely heavily on visual observation, appreciated being able to check their surroundings thoroughly. Several pilots noted that the visibility alone might justify the aircraft if other problems could be resolved. The Battle of Kuban in spring 1943 provided the Spitfire's first major Eastern Front test. The 57th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment received Spitfires in March 1943, followed by the 821st Fighter Aviation Regiment. Soviet commanders, eager to deploy this famous aircraft, threw the units into intense combat over the Kuban bridgehead, where German forces fought desperately to maintain their foothold. The results disappointed everyone involved. Unforeseen problems emerged immediately. Soviet squadrons flying Spitfires found themselves attacked by their own anti-aircraft gunners. The distinctive elliptical wings, so different from Soviet aircraft profiles, confused Soviet air defense troops who opened fire on their own planes. Multiple friendly fire incidents occurred before proper identification training could be completed. The losses to Soviet anti-aircraft fire nearly equaled losses to German action during the first weeks. German pilots experienced their own confusion. Hauptmann Wilhelm Batz, flying with Fighter Wing 52, encountered Spitfires over the Kuban and initially refused to believe his eyes. After landing, he reported the contact to his commander, who dismissed the claim as impossible. British Spitfires on the Eastern Front. Impossible. You must have misidentified YAKS, Batz insisted. The elliptical wings were unmistakable. Only after multiple German pilots reported identical contacts did the Luftwaffe confirm Spitfire deployment. The surprise was complete. German intelligence had failed to predict British fighters appearing on the Eastern Front. The tactical employment initially proved disastrous. Soviet doctrine emphasized close support of ground operations. Fighters were assigned to patrol specific ground positions at relatively low altitudes. This doctrine, developed for Soviet aircraft characteristics, poorly suited the Spitfire's strengths. The Mark 5B's optimal performance occurred above 15,000 feet, where its supercharger provided maximum boost. Soviet commanders assigned Spitfire units to patrol at 8,000 to 10,000 feet, tying them to slow-moving ground positions. German fighters, operating with tactical flexibility, typically held altitude advantage and chose engagement conditions. The Spitfire units found themselves at permanent disadvantage. The narrow-track landing gear created serious operational problems. British airfields featured prepared surfaces. Even grass fields used by the RAF offered relatively smooth conditions. Soviet airfields were often hastily prepared strips bulldozed from whatever ground was available. Mud in spring, dust in summer, snow in winter. The Spitfire's narrow landing gear, perfectly adequate on British fields, proved dangerously unstable on rough Soviet surfaces. Ground loops occurred frequently. Wingtip strikes damaged aircraft. Several Spitfires were written off in landing accidents that wouldn't have occurred with wider track landing gear. Maintenance difficulties compounded operational problems. Soviet mechanics, lacking proper manuals and specialized tools, struggled to maintain the complex Merlin engines. The liquid cooling system required careful management. Coolant specifications had to be precise. Soviet antifreeze substitutes sometimes caused corrosion. Winter operations proved particularly challenging. Soviet mechanics were accustomed to radial engines that tolerated harsh conditions. The Merlin's sophistication demanded care that field conditions often prevented. The spare parts shortage became critical within weeks. British supply chains, stretched thin supporting global operations, provided inadequate parts deliveries. When Spitfires required replacement components, Soviet units sometimes waited weeks or months. Aircraft sat grounded awaiting parts that never arrived. Cannibalization became common practice. Ground crews stripped parts from irreparable aircraft to keep others flying. This degraded overall fleet readiness as the number of flyable aircraft steadily declined. The 57th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, which received Spitfires first, flew them for approximately 2 months before requesting different equipment. During that period, the unit achieved minimal combat success. Few confirmed victories were recorded. Loss rates exceeded those of comparable units flying Soviet aircraft. The regiment's commander filed reports recommending against continued Spitfire operations. The 821st Fighter Aviation Regiment experienced similar frustration. Their operational period with Spitfires lasted slightly longer, but produced equally disappointing results. Pilot morale suffered as crews watched other regiments achieve success with YAK-9s and LA-5s, while they struggled with unfamiliar British aircraft. Several experienced pilots requested transfers. The regiment eventually transitioned to Soviet equipment, relegating the Spitfires to training duties. Despite initial problems, some Soviet pilots gradually developed better tactics. Rather than following standard Soviet doctrine, they experimented with employment methods that exploited Spitfire strengths. Flying higher altitude patrols allowed the supercharger to provide maximum performance. Using the excellent visibility for defensive awareness helped avoid unfavorable engagements. Emphasizing the Spitfire's turning ability in close combat produced occasional success. However, these tactical adaptations never overcame fundamental problems. The spare parts shortage meant that no matter how well pilots flew, aircraft availability continued declining. By summer 1943, many Spitfire units operated at 50% strength, or less simply because aircraft couldn't be maintained. The persistent problems led Soviet authorities to request better equipment. In negotiations with British officials, Soviet representatives specifically requested Mark 9s instead of Mark 5Bs. The British eventually agreed. Beginning in late 1943, shipments of Spitfire Mark 9s began arriving. These aircraft represented enormous improvement. The two-stage Merlin 66 engine provided substantially better performance. Speed increased significantly. Climb rate improved dramatically. Combat capability at altitude exceeded anything previously available. Soviet test pilots evaluated the Mark 9 favourably, acknowledging its superiority over earlier variants. Between late 1943 and mid-1945, Britain delivered approximately 1,188 Spitfire Mark 9s to the Soviet Union. This massive delivery represented significant British commitment to supporting the Soviet war effort. These weren't worn-out cast-offs. These were relatively new aircraft, many coming directly from production. The Mark 9s equipped numerous Soviet air defense regiments, particularly units defending Moscow, Leningrad and Murmansk. Yet even the superior Mark 9 saw limited frontline combat service. The reasons were multiple and complex. First, the war's momentum had shifted decisively. By 1944, Soviet forces were advancing westward. The desperate defensive battles of 1941 through 1943 had given way to offensive operations. Soviet air superiority was established. The critical need for every available fighter had passed. Second, Soviet domestic production was thriving. The Y-AK-9 production reached peak efficiency. The Lavochkin LA-7, introduced in 1944, provided performance matching or exceeding the Spitfire Mark 9 while offering familiar maintenance and logistics. Soviet commanders, given the choice between proven domestic fighters and foreign aircraft requiring separate supply chains, increasingly chose domestic options. Third, the integration challenges never fully disappeared. Even with better maintenance documentation and improved parts supply, operating British aircraft alongside Soviet types created complications. Logistics became more complex. Maintenance required specialized knowledge. Ammunition supply remained separate. Training took longer. These factors discouraged widespread frontline deployment. The Spitfire Mark 9s found their primary role in air defense rather than frontline combat. Soviet air defense forces, protecting cities and strategic targets, valued the Spitfire's high-altitude performance. German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at extreme altitudes to avoid interception, could be engaged effectively by Mark 9s. One recorded combat on March 8, 1945, saw pilots Vorybin and Fedotov intercept and destroy a Junkers Ju-88 reconnaissance aircraft flying at very high altitude near Leningrad. Their Spitfire Mark 9s reached altitudes where Soviet fighters couldn't operate effectively. This single engagement justified the type's deployment. The Spitfire's Eastern Front story reveals profound lessons about military equipment evaluation. Excellence in one context doesn't guarantee success in another. The Spitfire succeeded magnificently defending Britain because British conditions suited its characteristics. Prepared airfields supported narrow landing gear. Established logistics provided maintenance and parts. High-altitude combat exploited supercharger advantages. RAF doctrine employed the aircraft according to its strengths. On the Eastern Front, every condition changed. Rough airfields punished narrow landing gear. Disrupted logistics prevented proper maintenance. Low-altitude combat negated high-altitude optimization. Soviet doctrine employed aircraft differently. The same airplane that was excellent in Britain became problematic in Russia. Context mattered enormously. The timing issue proved equally important. Equipment that arrives too late loses value regardless of quality. The Mark 5B would have been valuable in 1941 when Soviet aviation was collapsing. By 1943, Soviet recovery had produced alternatives. The Mark 9 would have been valuable in 1942 when Soviet fighters struggled against improved German aircraft. By late 1943, Soviet designs had caught up. Lend-Lease timing often lagged behind need. The Soviet criticism of receiving worn-out aircraft while Britain kept new variants revealed legitimate grievance. Lend-Lease was supposed to provide aid, not dispose of unwanted equipment. Soviet pilots risked their lives in combat. They deserved equipment at least equal to what British pilots received. The perception that Britain was offloading cast-offs, whether fair or not, poisoned attitudes and reduced effectiveness. The maintenance and documentation issues demonstrated that transferring complex equipment requires more than shipping hardware. Proper manuals, adequate spare parts, technical training, and ongoing support are essential. Britain, stretched thin supporting global operations, couldn't provide adequate support infrastructure for Spitfire operations in the Soviet Union. Without that infrastructure, even excellent aircraft became maintenance nightmares. The contrast with the P-39 Airacobra proves particularly instructive. Soviet pilots loved the American Bell fighter, despite its poor reputation in American service. Why? The P-39 suited Eastern Front conditions perfectly. Low-altitude performance was excellent. The tricycle landing gear handled rough fields beautifully. The nose-mounted cannon provided firepower Soviet pilots appreciated. Maintenance was relatively simple. Most importantly, American support was excellent. Spare parts arrived regularly. Maintenance manuals were provided in Russian. Technical representatives assisted Soviet mechanics. The P-39 succeeded not because it was superior to the Spitfire in absolute terms, but because it matched Eastern Front requirements and received proper support. Context and support mattered more than raw capability. Soviet top aces flew P-39s to great success. Alexander Pokrishkin, second highest scoring Soviet ace with 59 victories, flew Airacobras almost exclusively. Grigory Reshkalov, third highest scorer with 56 victories, also preferred the American fighter. These weren't inferior pilots accepting inferior equipment. These were elite aviators who recognized that the P-39 suited their needs better than the famous Spitfire. The post-war period saw rapid retirement of Soviet Spitfires. By 1946, most had been withdrawn from service. Some were scrapped. Others were relegated to training duties. A few survived in air defense units until the late 1940s before final retirement. The brief Soviet service life contrasted sharply with continued Spitfire operations elsewhere. The Royal Air Force flew Spitfires into the 1950s. Many air forces worldwide operated the type for years after war's end. The Soviet Union alone abandoned the Spitfire quickly, testimony to their unique dissatisfaction. Historical analysis confirms that Soviet criticism wasn't mere propaganda. Western historians examining Soviet documentation found legitimate complaints supported by evidence. The aircraft were indeed worn out. The Mark V-B was indeed obsolete by 1943. Equipment was indeed removed. Spare parts were indeed inadequate. Soviet domestic fighters were indeed comparable or superior by that point. The criticism was honest assessment, not political bias. The broader Lend-Lease program proved enormously valuable to Soviet survival. American trucks, food, raw materials, and other supplies made critical differences. Some aircraft types, particularly the P-39, served with great distinction. The Soviet Union acknowledged Lend-Lease importance publicly and privately. The Spitfire disappointment was specific, not representative of overall Lend-Lease evaluation. The story reminds us that military effectiveness depends on matching equipment to conditions. The finest weapon in the world becomes useless if conditions don't suit its characteristics. The Spitfire was magnificent. The Spitfire was legendary. The Spitfire saved Britain. But the Spitfire wasn't right for the Eastern Front at the time it arrived. Soviet pilots didn't dislike the Spitfire because of prejudice. They disliked it because they received worn-out examples of an obsolete variant without proper support at a time when superior alternatives existed. They disliked being treated as recipients of Britain's cast-offs rather than allies deserving equal equipment. They disliked struggling with unfamiliar maintenance while watching other units succeed with familiar aircraft. Their criticism was rational evaluation by professional aviators who understood their needs better than distant Allied officials. The paradox of the unloved Spitfire teaches that reputation isn't reality. The most famous aircraft in the world encountered perhaps its only critics, not because it was bad, but because circumstances conspired against success. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong condition, wrong support. The mathematics of failure were written in these accumulated disadvantages. Even legends can fail when context changes. The Soviet experience with the Spitfire stands as permanent reminder that excellence is contextual, that timing matters enormously, that support infrastructure determines success as much as raw capability, and that the gap between reputation and reality can be vast. The aircraft that saved Britain couldn't save itself from Soviet disappointment. That contradiction captures the complexity of war, where simple answers rarely exist and context determines everything. The Spitfire remained magnificent. But on the Eastern Front, magnificence wasn't enough.